Okay, this is us live. We are now live, and my discussion tonight is the third of a series about the Belt and Road Initiative. And today, I feel this is a special day for me because I'm meeting Mubarack for the first time online, and we've actually shared platforms before. We've been on the same TV show before, but never had a chance to meet. So my little channel is growing, and I'm very grateful for you. I know how busy you are. Thank you very much for coming on to our little show this evening. Thank you.
Welcome, Jerry.
By way of introduction, I don't know too much about you. I know that you are now a Ugandan TV host, but I happen to know this is not your first time in Beijing. You studied in Peking University, PKU, right?
That's right, correct.
How did that come about?
Well, I thank you so much, Jerry, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I am really honored to be on this platform. And at the same time, I feel happy that I'm meeting you for the first time. We've shared ideas, as you just earlier said.
Thank you.
It came about a few years ago. I had gone to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to cover the African Union Summit on the usual summit for the African Union. So at that time, the African leaders were discussing the Africa we want, or the Africa that they want to see in the next 50 years. That is the discussion that led to the formulation of the Agenda 2063, African Union Agenda 2063. And this agenda was mostly focusing on what issues that Africa needs to focus on to be able to develop. But prior to that, the African leaders had identified quite over 30 strategic bottlenecks, which were hindering Africa from getting into industrialization and development, just like other continents. And some of those bottlenecks certainly included, there were some African leaders who were arguing that they needed an African agency to come and perhaps negotiate African interest, not in this segmentation. The African continent, although it is quite big in terms of size, it has a lot of political control over different small, countries, I would say, small in terms of size. And when we quite interacted with quite a number of leaders in Ethiopia at that time, we so happened that China had been given an observer seat in that summit, in the African Union, because you remember that also it contributed a lot to building that headquarters at the African Union.
Yep.
And African leaders mostly, on some of the bottlenecks they had highlighted, was the fragmented market. As I told you, there are 54 African countries, and yet we are having 1.2 billion people. So some African leaders were arguing that, look, if we were having all these 1.2 billion people under one political control, under one country, we could be different regions, but having Africa negotiating on the same table with other countries as a whole, rather than negotiating as different small countries, would benefit Africa as more than we do it in our individual countries. So that was the discussion that was going on. So another bottleneck that was strategic was about poor infrastructure. Although these countries were not connected, so we are connected by borders, they are small, they are on the same continent, it was very hard to connect from one country to another country. And yet they are very small, but at the same time, they are not so much distant from the other. But it was more complex than actually connecting a country like India to China, or India or China to Russia, things like that. So that was the discussion. So during that forum, I had to put together one article, which was challenging what the West was actually talking about Belt and Road Initiative, that it was a debt trap and that it was a colonial scheme. However, I had not been so much interacted with the Chinese, and I'd never been into China. I had only looked at what the Belt and Road Initiative was offering, regardless of what was, what was, being said about it. I was only looking at the substance of it rather than the form. So that's how I got to my newsroom when, after authoring that article. My newsroom was, of course, it caused a lot of quite very interesting debates within our newsroom. And the editor-in-chief of that newsroom decided to ask me to apply for a Chinese scholarship, which I couldn't get at the moment, at that time. So I happened to have been sent by my company to go to Renmin University to attend. There was a program called China Africa Press Center, which was together a number of African journalists, Asia Pacific journalists, and most of the Latin American journalists. In other words, Belt and Road countries, journalists from that area were gathering in Beijing to discuss how they can collectively report their story, because we had identified a gap of allowing foreigners or allowing people who have their own agenda to come and tell our own story, and yet we had everything it takes to have our own story. So that's how I got into China. I joined Renmin University. I attended it for 1 year, and I left. I went back home. I came back after a year. Also attended one of the seminars until Peking University opened up applications. I applied, and I was given a scholarship to study a master's degree in law, international relations, majoring in international relations. And that's how I got to Peking University. That's my journey of how I started interacting with China to date.
Oh, that's very interesting. You actually went to Xinjiang as well, didn't you, in your travels? You wrote some great stories about Xinjiang.
Yes, Xinjiang was quite interesting, and the reason to why Xinjiang specifically, I did not plan to go to Xinjiang. I was still focusing on my research, and my research had nothing to do with China. It was an African research.
Okay.
But we were in a holiday during the time of, we were certainly experiencing COVID-19 at the time. And the community where we were living, people were, of course, some of them were facing some kind of psychological torture during, the COVID-19 effects. Some of them felt like they needed to go out and have some fun. So we were asked the university asked us to choose which places everybody wanted to go to. Many of my friends actually chose to go to Shanghai. Others chose to go to Chengdu. Others chose to go to Chongqing, very different various cities. Others chose Macau. But I honestly speaking, I first chose to go to Macau because I wanted to go and see Macau. I have never been to Macau. Mm-hmm. But when I went back to my room, I came to realize that I think I have missed a much bigger opportunity to go and see Xinjiang with my own eyes.
Yeah. And because you are a Muslim as well, right?
Yes, I am a Muslim because it's not so much easier leaving Beijing to Xinjiang or leaving Shanghai to Xinjiang. So I realized that I'm going to miss an opportunity because when I was coming to China, one of the things that I got from my family was so much uncomfortable, me traveling to China.
Oh, really?
Because of the Xinjiang story. And my father is a Muslim and is one of a staunch Muslim. So he told me, my son, you're going to a country which is committing a genocide against
persecuting
Muslims.
at least.
Yeah, and you're Muslim. So I decided to, but I never shared this with him. So I wanted to go and say it myself. So I asked one of the organizers at the university whether it is possible for me to change my choice. And indeed, I changed the choice. I chose to go to Xinjiang. I went to Xinjiang. I want to tell you, Jerry, it was one of my scaring trips I've ever made in my life. I've been to different countries where there is war, but I'd never been scared like the trip I took to Xinjiang, because I really thought that it was a massacre going on in Xinjiang. And
so you mean you were scared before you went, not scared when you arrived there and saw?
I was very scared before going there, because although the Chinese government was saying that it is not true, I also couldn't believe it, because my family was also under pressure to me, saying that you are going to a country where they commit genocide against fellow Muslims and you must stand with fellow Muslims. I said, but I need to go there and see. What I saw, Jerry, in Xinjiang is the total opposite of what is being said in Western media. And my father, when he read the article, he was shocked, I must say.
I hope your father believed you and now looks more critically at what he hears about China. I'm sure he would do.
He believed me, I must tell you, because I went to...
I would love to talk to you more about Xinjiang. In fact, I think, if you don't mind, sometime in the future, let's get together again and have one show dedicated to just that topic, because there is just so much information. Let's move back to the Belt and Road. And Jenny Pung has just put a note on here saying, could you say something about the forum you participated in? And I was going to ask that question. What have you been through? I mean, you must be totally exhausted. You're jet lagged from flying from Uganda. You've had 2 very full days in the summit. What did you experience there?
Well, I must say this is my second Belt and Road Forum to attend. I attended the 2019 forum before COVID-19. And the first forum was at a time before COVID-19 came, into our lives. The experience I had then, I never thought that we would have the same experience today, but I'm sure we have had the same experience today. Coming from Uganda, for our viewers who may not understand Uganda is a very, it's not very, but it's a small East African country, which falls directly in the category of the lack of connectivity between the countries that are neighboring it. And from that background, although some other countries may benefit at a larger scale in terms of investment, but the little that goes to Uganda puts a lot of effect onto what goes on, because it's a small country, but with bigger problems. So whoever comes to help on solving one of the problems is welcome. And that's the background to how I go to Beijing. Now, coming to Beijing, I came, of course, expecting to see progress and see reassurance, because China has also experienced shocks related to COVID-19, just like any other country. Yeah. So I came to China for this forum specifically to look at what is President Xi and Chinese government's vision post-COVID-19 regarding Belt and Road Initiative, because there were fears that because China had also been affected, the trickle effect may actually go to Uganda. To my surprise, or to my advantage, or to my, what I really expected is that President Xi laid out the 8, point focus program, which clearly showed the world that Belt and Road Initiative is not about to end. And those who are benefiting must certainly continue benefiting, but certainly ensuring that we guard it jealously. One of the key takeaways that I got from President Xi was his statement about Belt and Road Initiative. Jerry, when you hear a leader talking about planning together, sharing together, and then benefiting together, that leader is focused and knows what he's talking about. And that's the reason as to why most of us in these developing countries, we feel it is the time for developing countries to work together. And this is what is being articulated well by President Xi.
Good. Well, we've got a question here about what improvement Uganda has seen, but we will come to that. So, Tommy Pukra, we will come to that. One of the things I wanted to raise, you talked about the Belt and Road connectivity, and I think it was a tweet where you bumped into one of your old PKU alumni, and I guess that's quite a good feeling as well when you're seeing people from other African countries coming to cover the same event. But I'm going to discuss with you today a couple of other things, namely the poverty alleviation, the sustainable energy, the things that you've mentioned about in your articles. But connectivity, what do you mean when you say that? Because you said that Uganda is not a very well-connected country as well. So how does that feel? What's changing?
Well, I think from the inception of Belt and Road Initiative, many of the people and many of the analysts may not have paid attention to what connectivity is all about and what connectivity China or President Xi was talking about. It has been in various stages. One, physical connectivity. In other words, people connecting with another through various means. I mean, physical infrastructure, literally. So you got a road to connect to from Uganda to Jerry's home, from Uganda to Laos, from Uganda to the Caribbean. So, and of course, railways, airports, and hydropower projects, all that is categorized in the physical connectivity or the physical infrastructure that enables us to connect even more. In that aspect,
go on.
Yeah, in that aspect, I would give you one example.
Please.
A distance from Uganda or Kampala, the capital of Uganda, to Kinshasa, the capital of Democratic Republic of Congo, is just 1,300 kilometers. You cannot travel by road to connect a neighbor, but you got to go through a different country.
Oh.
To go by flight, it has been a practice that many people actually needed to first take a flight to Belgium or to France to connect to a neighboring country. Now, most of these countries are landlocked. They are not at the coastal countries. So in other words, what this physical infrastructure is entailing to do and what it intends to do is to connect those who are landlocked, to link them, to make them land-linked, in other words. That's the essence of the physical infrastructure and the physical connectivity. Now, from that physical connectivity, there is something that many people never understood that where we were going, and that's the social connectivity. That's the social infrastructure. In other words, right now, if I am traveling anywhere, I can't fail, I can't get stuck and Jerry is somewhere. I can be able to help here and there. We have met under the Belt and Road Initiative the message that you were seeing me sharing on Twitter or on my other social media platforms, I was only sharing the fact that we had been friends with many people that we had never met, but because of that platform, we are able to meet. How does this happen? There is a common goal, and that common goal is to ensure that a new world is put in place where all of us are equal. All of us can determine our future. But you cannot have some people, for example, cannot connect, cannot access health services, cannot access good, clean water, cannot access free education, free health services, and of course, many other things that comes with those infrastructure. And then you think that person can as well sit on the same table and negotiate and discuss and participate in choosing a future that we all want. So that is the reason to why we got to that platform, the Belt and Road Initiative. So the connectivity has gone even far beyond the roads that we build. It has now tapped into people's lives. Now people are marrying one another. People now can share values. Of course, one of the principles of the Belt and Road Initiative, which we all appreciate, is the diversity, accepting that Jerry has values that he believes in. I also have values that I believe in, but we have common, aspirations. And that aspiration is to ensure that everybody, regardless of where they come from, they can sit on the same table, they can agree to disagree. For example, I am a Muslim. Jerry, you're not a Muslim. No. We want a world where somebody can sit on the same table, put your pork here. I will not eat your pork, but that's not a problem. Eat your pork on the same table that I am eating on. And that's the world that we are trying to build. And that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is trying to bridge. And that's the connectivity we are talking about.
There's one other aspect, which I think it was the president of Kenya raised. He mentioned that if he wants to trade with, say, Ethiopia, a neighboring country, he has to use US dollars. And that needs to change. I think the Belt and Road and probably BRICS and possibly your African nation, African Union would fix that as well.
Yeah, I think we share same views with President Ruto of Kenya. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure many African leaders have actually been articulate when it comes to issues relating to the de-dollarization process. We all agree that we cannot be a prisoner of someone who is printing paper and selling the money that you got to use. We have our coffee, we have our bananas, we have our avocados, we have our chili. We will just take chili to Russia or to UK, to United Kingdom, and we say, Mr. Sunak, we want your oil or we want your electronics. But we do not want to use dollars. We have our coffee. If you can come as well and take our coffee, we are glad to take your coffee, to take your electronics. But in case you say that you are not interested in our coffee, we are also ready to bring to you our currency, sell it, and certainly get the money out of it. Otherwise, this hegemony of currencies, and this is the conversation that was even going on in BRICS. Although it's a good idea to have a common currency for BRICS, some people still have views that are actually contrary to that. And that's the beauty with BRICS, and of course the understanding now of the developing world, that there are also people who believe that creating another BRICS currency will certainly make another dollar somewhere else, not in Washington, DC. So what conversation should focus on is to ensure that all these countries need to be able to sell and to buy in their own currencies. No one should actually stand in the middle and say, you can't buy my products. simply because you don't have a dollar. Because I do not understand, and this is the views that actually we share. I want to buy from Pakistan. I do not need a US dollar because US is not involved in this business. It is me and the President Shabab, so Prime Minister Shabab. So it has to be between two countries agreeing to buy or to sell whatever they want to sell. And this environment has to be created. It can't be created under the current world order. It can only be created under the frameworks like those of Belt and Road and the BRICS and like-minded frameworks.
That seems to be a good philosophy to adopt. Trade is trade. That's how it started. It shouldn't be about one currency, and certainly not one that's just printed on paper. Let's move back to the Belt and Roads. Actually, I want to talk first of all about the story. You are, and I don't think many people really appreciate how good a writer you are. You're a very good writer. You wrote a love story about the Belt and Road. I've never seen anyone do anything like that. And I know I couldn't do it. You wrote about two people from different parts of Uganda who met on a Belt and Road project and now are a family. Tell us a little bit about that story. It's a beautiful story.
Well, I had Jerry. That story is quite an interesting one. We had a conversation I work in a newsroom where there is a lot of I don't know, there are many people with different divergent views. There are people in our newsroom who clearly don't like China.
Of course.
There are people who don't like clearly US. There are people in the newsroom who don't like UK. So it's a diverse newsroom. But what makes it a newsroom is to be able to accommodate all people of the different views. Now, this story came up after a discussion when we were trying to prepare for the Belt and Road and how we are going to cover it. One of the colleagues sent us a message telling us that we need to ensure that we bring out stories of how the Chinese people are connecting with the African people, because we are telling the African story. And so that we can bring out the concept and the principle of connectivity and people-to-people exchange. So I had earlier visited a certain hydropower project. It's called Karuma project. It's one of the biggest now in Uganda. It's projected to be about 99% complete. It has delayed a bit, but it is going to be generating 600 megawatts of electricity. Now, many people do not seem to understand Uganda's generation capacity was below 1,000 megawatts. And our consumption capacity, we had to consume over 1,500 megawatts of electricity. But our capacity was only below 1,000 combined with other sources of energy. So this Karuma project is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is going to generate 600 megawatts, meaning it will be adding on to the 1,000 that we had to make it 1,600, meaning that after that completion of this project, Uganda will be able to generate more electricity more than the consumption capacity it has. And any person who really understand what we are talking about with this kind of a project. So I dismissed the idea of showing how China or Chinese people are connecting with the African people, the Asian people, and the European people. I said the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative already put a platform where people, regardless of whether Chinese or not, can as well meet. And when I went to that project, I realized that one of the engineers had met one of the ladies who was working in a procurement office. Now, the gentleman is living near the Uganda-Rwanda border, which is about 600 kilometers from the project. Mm-hmm. And then the lady was born in a Uganda-South Sudan border, the district of Nebi. So it was also about 500, 600 kilometers from the project. So in other words, people meeting from 500 kilometers south, 500 kilometers north, they met at the same project. Then I told my colleagues, this is the connectivity we have been talking about. So these people, this young couple met at the project. The project could not stop them because they are adults. They met, engaged, had a child, and started a family. They are now developing themselves. So I asked them one time when I visited them, what exactly did it mean for you to work under the same company, but at the same time doing different, of course, jobs, but under the same project? How does that feel like? They are like, we don't know how this happened, but all we know, we have a family. So I was like, if, for example, this story does not have a Chinese in it, it's a connectivity story of Ugandans meeting the Ugandans who are speaking different languages. That's the connectivity we are talking about.
So it must be a difficult thing. Where do they go to spend their holidays? Do they go north or do they go south?
Yes, absolutely.
And you know, the same story was covered in Algerian news as well. I was reading an Algerian newspaper yesterday, or Algerian media site, not a newspaper. And I was particularly reading about the building of a BRI mosque. The largest mosque in Africa was being built in Algeria through the BRI. And while I was looking through the site, I found your story, not written by you, written by someone else, but it's the same person, Mr. Bless, doing the same story effectively. Let's move on a little bit. I know that there are other projects, but that's the major one in terms of power in Uganda. Both U.S. ambassadors to China and Japan have recently been highly critical of the BRI, stating that it comes with strings. Now, you've actually put a different slant on this and said it's the World Bank or the IMF that lends development money with strings. What's the story about? What's the background story of that?
I think I must say that before I actually get even to that, I must make this clear, Jerry. The Belt and Road Forum on China, Africa, and Forum on Asia, Pacific, and Europe, and BRICS seem to have sent the World Bank, the IMF, and the Western major powers in this array. A few months ago, not even two, the World Bank suspended Uganda's financing and funding over a legislation that was passed in the Ugandan parliament criminalizing the LGBTQ community.
Yep.
Now, some of us have LGBT friends, but the majority of the country criminalized it. We feel sorry for them, and we never thought that it was a necessary legislation. But that's what our politicians did. The repercussion that we got, I have LGBT friends, I must confess this, Jerry, and I feel sorry for them whenever such a legislation comes, because we are building a new world where, whereas we are anti-gay, the gay people do not need to suffer whatever persecution that is being imposed onto them. And those are the ideas that we share. One of the responses that we got from the United States, from United Kingdom, from the Western world, and from IMF and from World Bank is to freeze funding. We thought that that was a string that is put onto a country simply because the country has disagreed with you.
Okay, can I ask one question here? My understanding, and I don't have a lot of experience with Ugandan politics, but my understanding is you have a very stable government. You've had the same president for nearly 40 years, I think, and he is elected. Now, the West say there are some issues with that, but that's common for the West when they don't like a leader. Is your government democratically elected, and can this problem be resolved for your LGBT friends? Can this be resolved at the next election?
Well, I must say this, I didn't want to really get so much into detail of this conversation because
we'll backtrack from it.
I have very close family friends who are really anti-LGBT. But what I know for sure that even the legislation that they are talking about is not necessarily criminalizing the people who are involved in it. It mostly centers around the promotion of the practice. Right. But at the same time, before it's usually a journey, because I'm sure all civilizations have gone through this journey. Our country is still a little much more conservative. We are literally 70% Catholic, Roman Catholic majority Christians, and Anglican Christians. We are minority Muslims, but certainly people are still a little conservative when it comes to their religions. Mm-hmm. But from what I saw from this legislation, if I'm to compare the first legislation in 2012 to the second legislation that we are having today, there has been a shift. The new crop of politicians, they are quite those ones who are actually now open-minded. They can have a conversation about whether to remove the criminalization or to remove the law, because there are those legislators who are actually having those views. However, they are also still majority of the conservative ones. So it's something that is coming with time. And for today's government, it is able to resolve it because even the first legislation was overturned by the Constitutional Court, meaning that in the judiciary, there are judges who have been able to guard against that legislation. I personally don't support the legislation, but I also don't support the actions put to my government over a legislation that can as well be negotiated otherwise. I think that was actually my view. However, going back to the question, Jerry, on they are saying that there are strings attached. They actually referred this to a death trap. That developing countries are actually being sent to a death trap, and also they were making allegations that the Chinese are in Africa to exploit our resources.
Yeah.
Now these are allegations that at least have never been seen anywhere. In Uganda, I do not think there is a story that came out recently, I think about a year or 2 years ago, where they had written that the only international airport that we have in the country was actually to be taken over by the Chinese. But these stories were actually being promoted by our friends in the Western media. This, Jerry, the truth of the matter is that even the grace period of that loan had not even expired. That's when we actually came out to publish this story. But the true story is, it is true that China has interests in Africa. Nobody should lie the other that China doesn't have interests in Africa. Just like Africa has interests in China. The same way Russia has interest in Africa is the same way Africa has interests in China. The same way US has interests in Africa is the same way Africa has interests in the US. And in fact, the discussion that as African young leaders, what we want to have is also to see how to have a conversation about Africa, US, Africa, China, Africa, Russia. And China has been certainly welcoming this kind of arrangement where you're having Africa, China engaging rather than China, Africa engaging. This is a discussion that President Ruto of Kenya was talking about. So the strings attached they are talking about for our World Bank friends, at least the World Bank has shown the strings that are attached to the aid. But the Chinese have never shown any strings attached, at least from now. We have not seen any airport, they have taken over. We have not seen any road, they have taken over. We have not seen any railway, they have taken over. So all we hear is just rhetoric telling us how they are actually going to take over these projects. Yeah. But however, excuse me.
The two countries that they mention most of all are Sri Lanka and Zambia. And Zambia is being renegotiated now. It has 22% of debt owed, of its international debt owed to China, 22%. That's quite a high amount for one country. Sri Lanka has 10% of its debt owed to China, 36% of its debt owed to the European Union, and the rest owed to America and other countries. So when they say that Sri Lanka, for example, is having trouble repaying China's debt, they're absolutely right. They are having trouble repaying China's debt. But the reason is because they have 80%, 90% of their debt with other countries. So they're having trouble paying everybody's debt. That's the problem.
Yeah, and Sri Lanka has come out openly on several occasions to actually clear these lies and to show, because truth of the matter is that our countries are indebted. That's not something that, needs to be lied about. However, the person whose money is in debt, the creditor of these countries, is being smeared to show that he's being a bad debtor, he's being a bad creditor, in other words. Mm-hmm. What we are saying, and also that conversation where it leads us to, nobody should blackmail China not to reclaim its money, because this money is Chinese taxpayers' money and it's got to be paid back. So when we borrow this money, it is our responsibility, of course, to ensure that whatever that money that we borrow, we put it to a good use. It does not in any way help for you to blackmail and to paint a picture. In fact, you're just blackmail. These friends of ours are trying to blackmail the creditor to get shy in bringing out his money. But this is an investment that has to be paid back, and that's the conversation that we're talking about.
Okay, let's move on from that, because I actually grew up in the UK, where when I was born, when I was young, homosexuality was a physical offense, and I have a gay brother. So I've lived through that, and the changes happen and they come. Let's move on and back to we talked about the 8 points, and I'm not going to go through all 8 points. We don't have enough time tonight, but I wanted to talk about green developments. Most people who haven't been there or been here still think China is a very dirty environment. Do you think that yourself, having lived here for a couple of years and now back here visiting? Is that true? And are China helping other countries to do what they themselves have done?
Well, truth of the matter is that some of the allegation that has been, you see, the biggest problem, Jerry, that we are having is to put politics in whatever that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Truth, this conversation about climate change and pollution in Beijing and all that. Yes, we all saw what we saw a few years ago. This is what literally everybody who went through the stage at which China was went through the same. Perhaps Europe could have gone through much worse situations than that of China. But maybe at the time, China wasn't able to poke into the affairs of the United Kingdom or European Union to tell them that that you guys, you are polluting the environment. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is that yes, there were some challenging climate issue challenges in China. And we have quite interacted with a number of them. But when you look at China today, because the first time I came to China, you could rarely see a blue sky. Today, you are able to see blue skies everywhere in Beijing, even in Beijing, which clearly shows that a lot of emphasis has been put to ensuring that climate change is actually given a priority. When it comes to investments that are going in Africa, of course, they also have challenges regarding certainly climate change issues. We recently had a challenge in Uganda. One of the Chinese companies is involved in exploration of oil, our oil, and that's Sinopec, a China national offshore oil company. Mm-hmm. And we had organized, in fact, we planned, and that project is still going on, to build a pipeline, a crude oil pipeline, which is called EACOP, the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, which comes from Kampala to the coast of Tanzania, and that's the coast of the Indian Ocean. Mm. And the European Union sat down and passed a resolution suspending the project, which was taking place in a completely an environment which is not their jurisdiction, and we've vehemently opposed it. Yes, we know that such projects have some environmental, negative environmental impacts. However, all our countries had gone ahead to ensure that environmental impact assessments were made. The risks that were involved were already taken into account. And certainly we know that these projects, they will have some negative impact. But African countries, it is their responsibilities to ensure that the risks are mitigated and are managed, because China is not going to force any project onto our continent. It is our countries, individual countries, to ensure that they put safeguards, to ensure that these projects do not have those negative, impacts.
Mm. Do you see that? Is that European interference? Because Europe builds oil pipelines, Europe builds gas pipelines, Europe builds all of these things that have the same environmental risks. And in fact, one of them got blown up, which was one of the biggest environmental disasters probably ever. Do you see that there's anything to do with them? Why are they doing this?
I think even the pipeline that I'm talking about, it is actually being constructed. More than 60% of that construction is being done by a French company, which is part of the European Union. And and these are the ones who have been doing these projects, especially in the African continent. I think it may not have been interference, but I think they have fought China so much that they can risk whatever that is coming their way. Because
China.
I think the fight may not be certainly about Africa, but the fight might be behind China. In other words, discrediting everything that comes from China, I think has become part of the Western, narrative. However, from the African perspective, I would borrow the words of President Nelson Mandela. He once told them that your enemies are not my enemies. In other words, China does not have any right whatsoever to tell us not to work with the United Kingdom. Just like United Kingdom does not have any right whatsoever to tell us not to work with China or Russia or Venezuela. So that's the respect that we all want.
Yeah. So China has gone, one of the other points that China talked about, Xi Jinping talked about, was the open world economy. The open world economy, which is something that you can't have when countries, European countries, UK, USA, are saying, we don't want you to deal with those people. We prefer you to deal with us. And America often say, we never tell anyone not to deal with China. But it's fairly obvious that they prefer their states, their trading partners, not to deal with China. Currently, one of the biggest growth areas for China is Mexico. And Mexico is now America, United States' #1 trading partner. So that's interesting, because the things that are coming, that used to go from here to the USA, are now going from here to Mexico and then into the USA. That's an interesting diversion. What do you think Xi Jinping means when he talks about an open world economy?
I think what I think, this is my view of what President Xi is talking about, is ensuring that an open economy means everybody should be allowed to participate without boundaries. You see, China, just like Africa and many developing countries, have ever been in the same place, have ever been isolated, has ever been, it became an abomination to hear that China is part of the World Trade Organization until 2001. And although, because China has the muscle now, it had the muscle by 2000 to force itself into the World Trade Organization. Assuming it didn't have that muscle, assuming it was still not as better as it is today, maybe at the North Korean level, what would have happened? And now these are issues that maybe President Xi, having been in that state of being isolated, of being labeled as a bad guy all the time, of being smeared as the person who is not honest and who is not able to work with everyone, knows the pain that those people who are not on that table are going through. There are many barriers that are going, on. They are, I would call them cartels. People have now the monopoly to sell coffee. I was recently showing my friends in Uganda is one of the biggest coffee producing countries. My president was recently telling me that a kilogram of coffee is sold at $46 US. You know how much Uganda gets out of that $46 dollars?
Not very much. $2.
$2, but
and that's to cover all of the growing, the harvesting, the processing, packaging, shipping, everything else. The guy who drinks it in Starbucks is paying a lot for it, though.
Absolutely. And for me, I have my coffee. For you, you have put on literally nothing, but you are actually getting much more than I do. What President Xi is meaning with that is that today you're seeing companies, of course, companies have been running to China to produce, of course, at a low cost. Now that companies are now moving, Chinese companies are moving to Africa to ensure that the cost of production is low. And that is also that's what entails an open economy where everybody is going to participate. When you come to process in my country, I'll get the jobs, I'll get the taxes, but certainly you'll get what you want. And that's what actually I meant. I read from it.
I have a couple of other questions. One point I was going to make: Uganda and China are very similar in some respects, and obviously size very very different. I say we because I'm in China nearly 2 decades now. In the last 30 years, Uganda has done something very similar to what China did. It's turned from an agrarian society. It's still quite agrarian, but their trade has grown like 900%. It's exponentially. Exports have gone from 5 billion to 45 billion in the last 30 years. What caused that? Or what helped that?
One of the reasons as to why we were able to make those strides was before, and this goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning. It was very hard. Reducing the cost of doing business in any place, you must have factors. They call them factors of production. Mm-hmm. Now, those factors of production are not, in other words, well available at a cheaper cost, the cost of doing business in that area will certainly be extremely high. There was no clean water. There was clean water, but certainly not so much scattered in different places. Mm-hmm. There were poor infrastructure connecting even roads themselves. No investor would come and invest in Uganda, because how would they be able to transport their goods to the market and certainly outside the country? 3, the manpower itself. There wasn't the human resource, the required human resource to ensure the skilled labor that were actually needed. And 4th is that there was, of course, some political turbulence, which was there before, different conflicts coming in from different parts of the country. But what this government did was to ensure that they create a priority, and that's in developing infrastructure. It started in early 2000, where you saw the biggest chunk of the national budget goes to building roads, goes to ensuring that there is power generation that is enough for the production. Now today, the cost of doing business in the country is slightly lower, not so much lower, but it's slightly lower, that investors from different parts of the world would come and do production from the country. That's what has that, and certainly you see development going on and on, with certainly employment going on, and of course with some kind of stability that has been on for quite some time.
So, final question as we're coming towards the end of the evening, and I was going to ask this question about Ugandans in general, but I'm going to specifically ask this question about your father. Are Ugandans, or is your father now optimistic and comfortable dealing with China?
That's, Jerry, a very, very hard question, but very easy to answer. I think, Jerry, what I have been able to achieve in all this is to show my father, because when I was still young, we were really at par. I agreed with him that, Chinese are bad guys. But when I was opened up to China, I realized that I need to tell the Chinese story to my father first. Every time we go to meet in a family conversation, I always tell him that, look, I told you China is not a bad country. And I think his views have now started to change. Not completely, but I think I need to find some time and bring him to China. And maybe then he will be able to, because he's visited China. But all I know is that I think
you can only change one Ugandan at a time. And I think what is happening in Uganda, particularly with the story of the couple with the, and this is why I thought this couple's story was so important, because it didn't just show a love story. What it showed was people who probably grew up like you did, thinking China's a bad place. And now they realize it's not. Now they realize that China is, it's quite a benevolent country, not an organization, it's a country, but it's quite benevolent. It's very benign in how it does its trade. All it wants is win-win. It wants you to do well, and it wants us to do well. That's how it is. So, what are your plans? No, before we finish, I have to say, where can people find you? You are on Twitter, I know that. You write for News Live in Uganda. You have a website there?
I write for the New Vision. Of course, the easy way to get to me is X, formerly Twitter. I also have a Facebook account, but I'm not so much familiar with it. Then Instagram, I use it, and WeChat. And also, I work for the New Vision, which is the largest media house in Uganda. I do write articles in the newspapers and certainly online. And I also host a morning show of the English TV station for the New Vision. That's where they can find all those handles can be found on my account.
New Vision in Uganda, and then let me just put that onto the big screen as well. New Vision in Uganda, and also just your name in YouTube, right? Sorry, in X, Twitter, formerly Twitter. And we've just reached the hour, and I really do apologize. There seems to be a problem. I put the microphone on hoping it would improve, but there's still some squeaky in the background. I'm sorry about that. And someone else agrees. Your enemy is not my enemy. That's a very good point to finish on. So, Mubarack, thank you very much for coming on, joining the show. I realize and appreciate how tired you must be today after 2 really hectic summit days and then all your traveling, etc. So thank you very, very much. And we will catch up. Thank you, everybody else who joined us. And I will look forward to the next time I see you here online. And we'll click the end of the stream now to say